Hello everyone and welcome to another one of our videos. Today is going to be the first one on the W221 S class, and it's going to be front brakes on this car. So I'm replacing the front rotors because the original ones are on the car right now. It's got about 90,000 miles and they're getting pretty lipped and pretty grooved. So I'm replacing those with Zimmermann rotors. One thing to note on the rotors, as well as the pads, they vary depending on the model of the car. So in my case, I have a 221 S550. It has a sport pack on it. Depending on what sport pack you might have, you may have different rotors and calipers. So make sure whenever you're buying the parts for your car that you check what rotors and calipers are on the car, or consult a dealer with an EPC so you can find out what the OEM part number was for your particular vehicle. In my case, this is a Sport Pack Plus 1 car, and this one uses part number 221, 421, 1612. That's the original OEM part number. The Zimmermann part number is the equivalent to that. And then in the case for my calipers, they use the Akebono part number EUR1223. I'm not replacing the pads with OEM pads. In fact, the OEM pads on this car are pretty much brand new, replaced by a dealership not long before I bought the car, but they dust like crazy. You may be able to see in the video, maybe not, but you can see where some fingers have touched the wheel and it's terrible. These only have about 10 days worth of driving on them, so I'm replacing with the Akebono Euro ceramic pads. I have these on all of my other German cars. They don't dust at all, really. Certainly much less than the OEM Mercedes pads. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and take off the wheel. 17mm socket should just come right off, and then we'll move on from there and go through the rest of the brake job. All right, so now I have the wheel off and we're ready to start pulling the brake pads out to start with the pad and rotor change. So to do that, the first step is going to be unplugging the sensor, which plugs in right here, and then removing the sensor harness from the caliper. Not needed to do the pad change, but needed to do the rotor change because we're going to pull this caliper off. So this sensor is held onto the caliper with an E10 torx socket. Just come in from the back here, comes right off, no big deal. Going to unplug the sensor, and then we're going to start removing some clips once we've done that. Now that we have the sensor plug removed, hanging just back there, as well as it unplugged, we're ready to start pulling the pads. Now to do that, we need to get this clip out of the way. This holds them, holds tension on the pads and holds them down in place. And to do that, we need to knock out the pad pins. So there's a pin right here, and a pin right here. And all you need to do is take a pin punch, like what I'm showing here on camera, and a hammer, and knock those out of place. So I'm going to go ahead and do the full knockout on camera, or off of camera. What's going to happen whenever you knock these pins out, they ride right here through the top of the caliper, as well as going through the brake pads themselves. What's going to happen whenever I knock that out, the first one that I knock out is going to allow the clip to kind of spring free, and I'll be able to knock out the second one a little bit easier and pull the pads out from there. So I'll show you what it looks like whenever I've got the pins knocked out and how to pull the pads out, and we will move forward from there. Alrighty, so before I remove the clip, I just wanted to show you what it looks like with it halfway out. So I have this pin knocked out all the way. Clip is free. Normally the clip is held down like that by the pin, holds tension, kind of just springs free. You can actually almost pull it out and out of the way entirely. Pins just come out the back side of the caliper. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and knock this bottom pin out. This clip's going to come fully free, and I'll show you how to pull the pads out. Alrighty, so pad pulling time. I've got this one loose, just did that off camera. Essentially all you have to do is take a screwdriver and pry very gently back and forth from corner to corner in order to get these pads loose and free. Mine were a little bit more difficult than some might be because I do have a pretty sizable lip on these rotors. They are very much due for replacement. And so I was able to get the pad loose whenever it was down in here, but then pulling it up, it just got hung up on the rotor. So I had to keep on going back and forth and kind of just loosening it up little by little until we were clear and ready to go. So pull out the pad, comes out just like that. Like I said, these are pretty darn fresh pads, but the brake dust out of these is just ridiculous. So I'm replacing them. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the other pad. Same method, it's going to apply. And then we will move on to pulling the caliper off. Alrighty, so we're now coming in from behind the caliper, which is right here. And in order to remove the caliper to replace the rotor, you need to remove the caliper bolts, which are right there and further down there. Those are 21mm, and you will need to remove them the best way that you are able to figure out how. In my case, I'm going to try using a ratchet with a socket. If that fails, then I may have to use a wrench and a mallet and kind of go from there. So we will see what works, we'll see what doesn't, and I will let you guys know. But what works for me may not work on a car with corrosion or something on it, so keep that in mind. You're going to need to use the best method necessary and available to you. Alrighty, we have the caliper off. You can see it hanging back here. I have it hanging from the upper control arm with a bungee cord. You can also use a caliper S-hook. In fact, I recommend that. I just don't have one on hand right here in this particular garage that I'm in. So, it's now time to remove the rotor. In theory, all that we should need to do is take out this screw right here. It's T30 Torx, should be easy peasy. And then, Lord willing, this being a California and Arizona car, there shouldn't be any corrosion back behind the rotor, at least not enough to seize it to the hub. So we should be able to give it a few good whacks with the mallet and have it come right off. So, first step, remove the screw, T30 Torx. Some of these cars also may have Allen heads, so just keep that in mind. Yours may vary. And we're going to go ahead and see what happens with taking off the rotor. Well, the brake rotor is off, and I hate Mercedes brakes. I've had this issue in the past on other Mercedes of mine, and had it again on this one, where the rotor likes to seize onto the hub. There's not a whole lot you can do about that other than grease the interface between the rotor and hub before you install the rotor onto the hub, a new rotor onto the hub. But this one was seized on, not as bad as one in the past, but pretty darn bad. Most people, they'll just take a big hammer and whack the rotor, let it have it until it comes off. I prefer not to do that because if it were to seize on completely and require you to order a tool or something, your car is essentially immobile at that point because you've dinged up the rotor and smashed it up to the point that you can't drive the car anymore. So, what I did was I took a piece of wood, clamped it to the back side of the rotor. You can see I actually let the rotor have it around here on the hat as well. So I gave it a beating on here and then took a piece of wood, clamped it on the back, and let it have it with a 4-pound hammer. And that eventually got it free. Not fun. I also had to soak it with WD-40. You can use Aerocroil, PB Blast, or anything like that to kind of try to penetrate into the hub and get the rust started to break down. But either way, that's what it took in this case. Like I said, not the most fun thing in the world. So, at this point, the rotor can come off, as you see here, and we're left with the hub. What I'm going to do is go ahead and just take a wire brush, clean up the hub. There's not a whole lot of corrosion, which shows you it doesn't take a whole lot to hold the rotor and stick it into place. I'm going to go ahead and clean it up with a wire brush and show you how to install the new parts. All right, you can see I have the rotor reinstalled now. This is the new one. I have the rotor screw installed as well. I just hand snug that and put a little bit of Loctite on there as well. Low strength purple Loctite. Essentially now, the process of reinstallation for everything else is going to be putting the caliper back into place and then putting pads back into place and making sure everything's clean and tightening everything down. So I'm going to go ahead and start with wiping down the rotor while everything's off and out of the way, just to make sure that everything's as clean as possible before I start reinstalling things. And then I'm going to go ahead and start putting everything back together, with the caliper being the first item to go back on. So I will bring you up to date and let you know what all needs to happen with each step in the way of reinstalling everything. Alrighty, got the caliper on and I got the brake pads in. You can see they're slid in right into place. Didn't have to push back the pistons really at all. There was one piston, this one up here on the front, that needed to come back just a little bit, so I took a little brass rod that I have, nice and soft, won't mar up any surfaces, and kind of pried that into position. Made sure to keep this pad back here in place. I don't know if all 4 pistons are tied together in this caliper, or how exactly they're tied together and how exactly the check valving or anything that may be in there may work. So I just wanted to be safe, put this in here. If you pry on a piston of a caliper, or if you pry on a pad of a caliper and you, let's say, don't have a pad in here and the pistons are able to come out, they may very well pop themselves out. So you may kind of seesaw and fight back and forth between sides of the caliper if you don't make sure that you're blocking everything other than what you're compressing. So, rotor's back on, like I mentioned, hand tighten that with some Loctite. I put a little bit of low strength Loctite on the caliper bolts and torqued them to the spec that I could find, which was 110 Newton meters, or 80 some odd foot-pounds is what that equates to. I believe 82 foot-pounds, somewhere around there. There's some specs that online that state much higher. I saw 150 and 180 Newton meters as alternative specs. I can tell you from loosening the bolts that they were not torqued to that prior. and I don't know if the calipers have ever been off of this car, but I have not taken them off, and the rotors had not ever been off. So with that said, my car was either torqued at the factory to 110 Newton meters, or a dealership at some point torqued them to that. So I'm going to assume that that's the correct spec, at least for my particular car. So at this point, all we need to do to finish the installation is put the clip back in place along with the pins. What I'm going to do with the pins is, before I put them back and before I put the clip back, I'm going to grease these with some Krytox grease. I also want to mention that I greased the hub. I wire brushed it off, and I greased it with a very, very thin coating of Krytox grease as well before I put the rotor on. That's something that I have on hand, that I keep on hand. It's a more expensive grease. You can use something that's high temperature resistant, like a silicone type of grease. No problem as well. Helps prevent the rotor from seizing on, like we saw earlier. And it also, in this case, helps the pin slide in nice and smoothly and stay in place. It also helps reduce any kind of rattle or squeal that you may have between pins and clip. So, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the clip off camera. Essentially all it's going to be is get clip in place, install one pin so it's kind of hinging in place, and push down the other end of the clip and install the other pin through. So it should be pretty darn straightforward, and at that point we will be done with this side, other than reinstalling the sensor connector and inserting the sensor. I'll show you that at the very end once everything else is in place. So we'll come back and I'll show you that little part. All right, so I have the brake pads fully installed now, pins in, everything's done, and the sensor installed. Now, I want to say a couple things about the sensor. I ordered some brand new third party, but one of the OEMs for German cars, sensors. So I ordered a pack of these. I didn't know how many I'd need. I didn't know if this car had sensors on all four corners or what the deal was, so I ordered enough for all four corners. They're relatively inexpensive. In looking at these versus the OEM Mercedes sensors that were in the OEM pads, these ones have the wires come out right here on the surface that faces towards the rotor. Now, while that may be okay on some applications, on this one, that makes the wires come and collide with the clip right here, which could cause an abrasion issue over time with vibration and everything. So I pulled the original Mercedes sensor out of the original Mercedes pads and installed it in here because it was still good. It wasn't rubbed through, it wasn't worn through, it hadn't been activated yet. Essentially, the way that you install these things is by pressing them into the pad. Now, it looks like from a previous attempt, the little clip had come undone, but the way that these work is they have a little metal clip around the plastic housing right there, and you have the pad right here. You have the slot and a little step. You just have to make sure that the rubbing portion of it right there is facing towards the rotor, so towards the pad surface as well, and you just press it into place. To remove it, all you really need to do is take a screwdriver. You can come in through here and just pry it and pop it out, and it should come out no problem. So that's it as far as installing the brake sensors goes, and that's it as far as installing the new pads and new rotors goes as well. Overall, the job was pretty darn easy, other than getting the rotor off, which is pretty typical for Mercedes. The reason I kind of rag on Mercedes as opposed to other manufacturers for that is because, at least in the world of Asian cars, a lot of the manufacturers there will put threaded holes in their rotors, and that will just let you take a bolt, M10, M8, M12, whatever the size may be, and thread it into the rotor, and normally they'll have two opposing ones, so you can just crank, 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 and it kind of just pulls the rotor off. It acts as a press or a puller almost. So I much prefer that. I wish other manufacturers would do that, but alas, Mercedes does not, so we're stuck with the old-fashioned hammer methods. But we got it done. Everything looks nice on this side. I've still got the other side to do, and if you're watching this video, you may have two sides to do. So with that, I want to wish you luck working on your brakes. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.